back in 1976, there were only 5 million people with diabetes. Today, between diabetes and prediabetes, there are 100 million people. And this dramatic increase reveals why so many people are more at high risk for Alzheimer's today. So is this the case? When we're dealing with Alzheimer's, should we be thinking of this as a sugar thing like diabetes, that the same way you would deal with diabetes, the same steps you would take to prevent diabetes, you'd be working on preventing Alzheimer's? I mean, is it, in your opinion, when people say Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes, is that something you think, or how do you think about it in terms of its relation to diabetes?
Can I start, Steve? Okay, if I start?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So I don't think it's necessarily around sugar. I think it's around prevention. So you go from 5 million to 100 and, what'd you say, 110 million?
100 million with diabetes or pre-diabetes.
Yeah. So you go 20 million increase in a disease in the span of 50 years. Well, what's doing that? And there has to be changes to our environment. And if look at, soda and fast food, industrial food production, the fact that we have soda machines in the schools with kids, I mean, what are we doing as a society and creating obese children? I mean, it is unbelievable what we are putting up with and tolerating. We should just be changing the course completely. And I think the same thing for Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's, I think air pollution would be a huge factor. Air pollution costs every person in the world 3 years of life. 3 years of our life expectancy is lost to air pollution worldwide. And I think it's fueling the rise of Alzheimer's disease and likely contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease. We mentioned cardiovascular disease, increasing your risk for Alzheimer's disease. Many of these diseases are to a large extent preventable. I think Parkinson's disease is to a large extent preventable. Obesity is certainly to a large extent preventable. Type 2 diabetes is certainly to a large extent preventable. Alzheimer's disease, to some extent, is likely preventable. ALS, to a large extent, may be preventable. Many cancers are preventable. Until we wake up and change our environment, hold our representatives accountable, we're going to continue to suffer the adverse health consequences. We'll pay 100 times more on the back end for treatments and cures that are toxic and disfiguring than we'll pay on the front end. If we change the course of it, like we did for HIV, like we live in a world free of polio. We don't have great polio treatments or great polio treatment centers because we just quite frankly have a world that's largely free of polio. If we do the same thing for these other diseases, we can live in a much healthier world, and one we can have longer, healthier lives for us to enjoy.
Well said, Dr. Dorsey. I agree. Now about diabetes, type 2 diabetes, I wrote a book called Diabetes Breakthrough, The Key to Insulin Resistance. And this is actually my latest book, and I'm giving a talk at this conference on April 10th, where I will be talking about diabetes and what is the problem. And the real problem with diabetes is not just sugars, it's sugars and saturated fat together. And this is the problem. The problem is insulin resistance, where the cell membranes of our muscle cells and our liver cells become insulin resistant. And they're insulin resistant because of the excesses of saturated fatty acids in the diet, as Dr. Dorsey mentioned, junk food, fast food, all of this stuff that is not really food at all. And a lot of it is loaded with saturated fat. Why? Because it's satisfying to the stomach. That's why people love saturated fat. If you get your saturated fat down, then what happens is, okay, when you have too much saturated fat in your body, then it changes the fluidity of the cell membrane so that fewer insulin receptors are found there, down to half as many. But there's more, because as you get more saturated fats, the insulin tries to get the excess blood sugar into the cells so it can't damage your arteries and your eyes and your kidneys. But it doesn't succeed because the transmembrane protein, the insulin receptor, has an alpha end that the insulin docks to and a beta end on the inside of the cell where an insulin receptor substrate has to dock into. But with excess saturated fats, you get excess cytokines like tumor necrosis factor alpha, which create, it's a long story, but I'll tell you a little more of it, which create suppressor of cytokine 3. And this inactivates the insulin receptor substrate so that it cannot make GLUT4, the glucose transporter, and it can't get the blood sugar into the cell. So this is the problem. Now, what happens when people lower their saturated fats for a couple of weeks? Their type 2 diabetes goes away. even if they're still eating rapidly absorbable carbohydrates and sugar, because our bodies work really well. If we don't have insulin resistance, we could drink, heaven forbid, 12 teaspoons of sugar in a Coca-Cola, and all of that sugar would trigger a bunch of insulin, which would trigger a bunch of insulin receptors, which, if they work well, would get that sugar into our cells. Okay, obesity may still be a result. And one of the problems with excess sugar is that once our glycogen stores are filled up and the cells have all they need, the excess sugar is made into palmitic acid, which is the worst saturated fat, to create insulin resistance. So excess sugar also creates insulin resistance. So my advocacy would be for keeping saturated fats below 12 grams per day and keeping sugars to slow releasing carbohydrates, such as are found in whole intact grains, beans, some root crops, and like purple sweet potatoes, and whole grains like maybe amaranth, quinoa, some of these. So that really is the story on insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Study after study, which I quote in my book and my lecture, have shown that you can reverse type 2 diabetes with this type of a diet. And unfortunately, it's not profitable. It's not a drug. It's not patentable. It just works.